Hooray! You've made it to the 4th episode of the Saxon Series. In this installment of the Saxon Series, we dig a little further into the second half of the 20th century, because that sets the scene for what's to come in the 21st. Like and subscribe and all that jazz, because you know what to do. We've tackled the first major years of the Low Saxon language. We've slowly entered the 20th century, and so much happened in the 20th century that we decided we have to cut things up and, well, basically devote another episode on the 20th century, but the second half.
Exactly, the second half, the post-war years.
Right.
Because in Europe, the way we view history in Europe is everything that happened before World War II, and everything that happened since World War II.
That's right.
And the big changes and social shifts have taken place, certainly in terms of how the regional languages have been affected.
Well, there's no denying that, is there?
Yes, so we can probably fill up an hour without any problem at all, before we get to the internet era, which is the story of the early 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, do you want to do a quick survey of what you've prepared? Because we've actually prepared something today, which is the first.
No, it's not a first. We prepared, but we probably be prepared in a bit more detail. Well, I'll jump right on in with a theory of mine concerning when Saxon ceased to be, by and large, organically passed on from one generation to the next. And people tend to see this as a very slow process where, of course, it does take a long time for a language to die or to disappear. It's always a matter of decades at the very least. But if you consider the situation that up to and right after the Second World War, and the Second World War set a lot of things in motion. Technologically, of course, wars always speed up technological innovation. Well, they can also bring you back to the Stone Age, but that's a separate discussion. Into the 50s, even if Saxon had long since lost its prestige and was not used in all domains that the national languages of Dutch and German were being used for, such as science and education, it was an informal spoken language. It was practiced as a written language, as a literary language by a small number of people, and beyond that, it was being kept out of most domains, including the mass media. Now, but unless you were too educated and too smart to speak it, the people by and large still spoke it, young to old, right? And children picked it up even regardless of where they were from. Like, even if they came from another part of the country and, say, sometime in the 50s, entered primary school in the traditional Low Saxon speaking areas, they would pick it up in the school ground, whether or not it was their home language. Then, if you fast forward just a little bit to, say, our time, from the 80s onwards, you get the situation which you and I are familiar with, that parents and certainly elderly people still very generally speak Low Saxon, like in this informal setting, among friends, among family members, at the supermarket, blah, blah, blah. But children, like us, our generation, us growing up, we spoke the standard language. We spoke Dutch with our peers, with our friends, and it would have been completely unthinkable in the vast majority of situations to try and speak Plat, because you would have been considered a yokel or out of your mind.
Well, I have to nuance that a bit, because
you go right ahead.
It's quite regionally defined, although yes, of course, the majority of people did speak Dutch. There are pockets of small villages, especially here in Twente, that were more removed from the centre than the parts where you grew up, I believe. There were quite a few speakers left, and there still are. There's still youngsters who speak it today, and who have absolutely no problem speaking it amongst themselves. But yeah, in my class, if I remember my primary school days, there were I think about 1 or 2 or 3 people in my class who spoke Low Saxon as a first language.
Mm-hmm. Though I don't want us to fall into the trap of saying, oh well, where I was from, people had switched to Dutch more than average, but there are other parts of the region where the unicorns live who still speak Saxon. I think New Lowson, my town, is a very typical town. It's not a tiny village. It's like a middle-sized town by now, but we call it a village. In the countryside and conservative communities, possibly also connected with an adherence to Christianity, it is still spoken. Also, you can hear it. You can hear younger people speaking it. Certainly, in pubs, if you visit cafes, cafeterias, pubs, not everybody who speaks it is 80 and above. People use it who are in the 20s or 30s. But still, the bigger picture is that the vast majority of young people, I'm now thinking, so children, adolescents, people in their 20s, 30s, young parents, the vast majority have no familiarity or affinity with it anymore, do not speak it, couldn't speak it if they wanted to. In most cases, don't particularly want to because they simply didn't grow up with the tradition. But so there is this giant disparity between the situation in, say, up to and including the 50s into the 60s, where, in parentheses, everybody spoke Saxon, except if you were too smart and too well educated to have a mastery of the language. And then with a small step into the 70s, 80s, 90s, where it is suddenly associated with elderly people, with farmers, with the lower working class, with people who've only gone to primary, secondary school. Right. So my theory, which I began by introducing, is that pretty much, or as a concept, as a framework, if you will, in the 60s, take that decade, that is when Saxon died. Not in the sense that there are no unicorns left, there are some, but in the sense that it stopped being this community language that was also spoken by the younger generations generally. And this means
it stopped being the default language.
Well put. And that means that it was not being passed on by parents starting in the 60s, 70s. And that switch was made very suddenly based on a kind of conviction that was considered self-evident that you had to protect children from the regional language so that they could acquire the national language properly. And so these parents are what we call the baby boomers. They're people who were born right after the war, when there was the euphoria of we can start rebuilding the country and Europe in general. And so there was this large cohort of people born in the 40s, early 50s. And it's them, those Woodstock people who didn't pass on Saxon as they ought to have. Because what is Saxon if not our local Schweizerdeutsch, or our local regional Norwegian, or our local Catalan, or Galician, or Basque, or Breton, or Walloon,
or what have you.
Well, I just mean to say there are these. We have proof that it's possible to speak a regional language and the national language, and that the former does not impede or impair your ability to use the latter. You can even be very metropolitan, cool, highly educated, urban, and speak Schweizerdeutsch in Switzerland, or Letzeburgisch, Limburgisch in not Limburgisch, Luxembourgish in Luxembourg, and also speak, well, they speak German, they speak French, they speak English. They're just about the coolest, most knowledgeable linguistically people on earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. That's my theory, all spat out. I hand the mic to you.
Thank you very much. You're quite right in that it stopped being the default language, but still many people still spoke it and still were taught this language. They were, well, let's call it what it is. They were indoctrinated that, their first language really wasn't a language at all. that it was just a debased variety of the national language, and that indeed it hindered them from acquiring the standard language properly, and as a result would diminish their chances in the work field.
Yeah, and this was exactly the same in Germany. You can read accounts of what people's experience was, and teachers set out on a mission in the 20th century and before that in the 19th century to eradicate Plattdeutsch, because it just had no place in the proper acquisition of Hochdeutsch, Standard German. I mean, these situations are very similar on both sides of the border from everything I've encountered and read. And the same for, speaker numbers, children versus older people. The situation is now very, very similar, where very generally young people have been prized away from the language and don't really have a mastery of it. They vary in to what extent they have a passive understanding or grasp of it if they hear their grandparents speak it. Although in Germany there was one phenomenon that caused the language to go on the back burner a bit faster than in the Netherlands, which was this massive internal displacement of war refugees after Germany was defeated in the Second World War. The Russians came in from the east, the Western Allies came in from the west and the south, and I think especially for the Red Army, there were a lot of Germans either who had lived in what is now east, or the eastern part of Germany, or further east in conquered territories in Poland. They went on the run, right? And so they massively established themselves in traditional Saxon-speaking areas in North Germany, but never acquired a command of the language. And so this required, for social cohesion, a big switch, a sudden switch to the common and commonly understood language of Standard German, which is just one more of many factors that hastened the quick disappearance and dislodging of Saxon, where it had been very generally entrenched in society.
Mm-hmm.
So, in connection with this, do you want to talk a bit about what you call the Neue Niedersachsen, the new Low Saxons? Who are they?
Who are they? Well, there's a new phenomenon because, as we've established now, the language wasn't passed on to children of today and children of previous generations, like Generation X and those who went before us. But there are some who now miss what they consider a connection to their identity, their roots, their Low Saxon, backbone, as you will. So those are the people who don't speak Low Saxon, may have heard some from their grandparents or parents, but they've never actively spoken it, and they now seek to reconnect with their history and their identity, and they're looking actively to start speaking this language, and they practice, and they are looking for ways to acquire this language after the fact.
Well, and you and I are, by and large, give or take, sort of examples of these. We didn't grow up learning it learning Saxon from our parents. Although each situation is different. Your situation is different from mine. I mainly learned it passively as a child and teenager from conversations between my mother and her mother, not between my parents, because my father isn't from the Netherlands. So, but it's very typical for young people who pick up a passive command of Saxon to skip a generation. They don't get it from their parents, but from their grandparents. And in your case, it wasn't handed on to you, but you heard your parents speak it at home, didn't you?
I heard my parents speak it amongst themselves and among the wider family, and in some cases to us as well if they weren't paying attention. And so whenever they made a conscious effort to speak to us, it was in Dutch. At a very young age, I was very, perceptive of dialectal differences and all that. So my father's from the next village and my mother's from the town we still live in. So I noticed small differences and I started questioning them for like, why do you say this and why does my father say this? So I was always a very language nerdy kid.
Yeah.
So, and it's very funny to see the gradual loss of the language, because I have two sisters and my oldest sister is about 10 years older than me. So she's from a generation earlier and she speaks the language perfectly, but only when she's quoting someone else, which is very funny. She's a perfect code switcher.
She's a code switcher, but she has the same parents as you do. So did she pick it up more from her friends at school or that she played with?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say, though, of course, I can also think of a few examples of young or youngish people who now have an interest in their heritage. Of course, it's now very clear once it's disappeared or disappearing. You're always conscious of something once it's on the way out. As long as it's everywhere, you take it for granted and you start missing it and flying into a panic once it seems too late to do much about it. But these examples that I can think of, they are sort of, well, like we freely confess to be language nerds. And they don't, if you think of affinities, some people are into soccer, some people are into knitting, some people are into, online role-playing, some people are into languages. And it is these language nerds who form a tiny segment of the overall population who take an interest in what was up to recently, and in a very fragmented sense still is, the language, the traditional indigenous language, ancient language of their region. So they don't form a critical mass, do they?
That's correct. I can't speak for other regions, but I do know that in my region, Low Saxon is still very much a part of the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever people, even if they don't learn it at home, when they enter the workforce and more in the, practical professions of, truck drivers and farm work and what have you, they will have to learn this language to communicate with their peers.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see usually is that people start learning this language or speaking it because they've already acquired the passive basics passively at a later age. So around the age of 18 and 19, which is exactly what happened with me.
Yes, because you went to work at a gardening company, didn't you?
I did.
And it was suddenly the question was sprung upon you, and you were, 18-ish?
19-ish, yeah.
Okay. And so you speak Twents, do you? Because you're going to have to.
Yeah. Or at least you're going to have to understand it.
Right.
Because, I got into the truck next to the big boss. And when I say big boss, he really was big. Yeah, he measured over 2 meters and 15 centimeters, I think. So,
gosh,
a very big man. But yeah, his first question was, "What is your name?" And the second question was, "Do you speak Platt?" And I had been gradually taking an interest in the language, so it coincided. So I was already interested, and I had the means and the opportunity to start speaking it, on a more regular basis.
Sure, and every young person's mastery of the language or knowledge of the language now is going to be very incomplete and fragmented, because no one grows up in a fantasy world where they speak it daily with both parents, and they read it on the internet and in magazines that they receive or buy. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. You hear it from conversations between your grandparents or in drips and drabs. But this passive and incomplete grasp that you acquire either you do nothing with it. Again, if you're too highly educated, you move away from the region. There's just no practical reason for you to use it. But on the other hand, there are people who go to work at the local old age home, and like you say, there is still a considerable practical need, or at least it's considered advantageous if you do speak the local language. And so this passive command can be sort of switched on in the right circumstances. It can be teased out, and then it can be built out. And that's just what I did for myself, because I had this imperfect, or still have completely, like compared to real natives like my mother or my grandparents, who know hundreds of words and expressions that I don't, and that are just not generally used anymore. But
and it's very, very funny. Just today, I asked my wife, who professes not to be a speaker. I was wondering about, masculine and feminine and neuter forms for nouns and all that, and because I noticed someone had written a word in the plural, what I believe to be wrong.
Yeah,
because they lacked the innate, or whatever you want to call it, sense of basically the genders of the nouns.
The instincts for it.
Yeah, the instinct. And but very funnily, I asked her, what do you think is the plural of this word? And she confirmed my suspicion that it was indeed a masculine noun, although she doesn't speak the language herself, but she does have this. She's heard it all her life around her, from her parents and the wider family. So there, it is there, passively.
Yes. Well, there are a lot of things that are there that are not being actively put to use, but of course they're going to be there for a period until they are lost entirely. But you can make the case that this is now a good time to start making headway with, if we want to, reintroducing the language in schools, whilst there is still this imperfect popular knowledge, also among parents and teachers. There are currently still a lot of teachers who, to some extent or other, are familiar with plot. But if we wait long enough, there will be none left, right? So this would be a good time to, step up to the plate and get things moving. But shall we look at some numbers?
Oh yes, throw them on me.
Yes,
I'm thrilled by numbers.
I'm not, so I'm going to keep it really brief. There was a survey done by one Geert Driesen.
I was joking.
I know you're an alpha fellow like me.
Very much.
The language type. About 10 years ago, the use of regional languages in the Netherlands, and the survey was done in 1995, in 2001, and in 2011. And was done for Frisian, for Low Saxon, for Limburgian, for Brabantic, for Zeeuws, for Hollandic, actual Hollands. And this was done based on a sample of primary schools where children and their parents, if both parents were born in the Netherlands, were asked about, do you speak the regional language in question? So for this sample, which is already an unrepresentative sample in the sense that it doesn't include people whose, for instance, where one parent was not born in the Netherlands, so children of immigrants. And then you see sharp drops across the board, even for a language like Frisian, which has long had for decades at least, a higher prestige than does Low Saxon. But even Frisian, which is already being taught in schools, is being increasingly put under pressure by Dutch, which simply, prevails in the popular culture, and it's hard to produce content, music content, internet content in these smaller languages to keep children engaged. Anyway, for Low Saxon, between the parents in 1995, about a third of these parents were speaking Saxon. It was only a quarter at the start of the 21st century, and about 10 years ago, it was 15%. So, optimistically speaking, young adults, parents, this was 10 years ago, maybe 15% still speak Saxon. Children to their parents, in 1995, about 7 or 8%. In 2011, about 1 or 2%. Children with their brothers, sisters, or friends, in 1995, 6 to 7%. 10 years ago, in 2011, about 1%. So really what you see there is that children who speak Saxon, at best, form about 1%. And I'll say one last thing, because I looked at the figures for Frisian and the languages I just mentioned, and then Hollandic, which are the traditional Hollandic dialects of the Western Netherlands, right? The province of North Holland and South Holland, were still being spoken in very low percentages back in 95. But in 2011, between parents, from the children to their parents, between children and their siblings and children and friends, the number is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, which doesn't quite mean that Hollandic has died out, because it's still being spoken by elderly people. But it's
things are looking grim.
Okay. Perfect way to put it.
Yeah. Happy to summarize. Yeah. You mentioned the 1%. How much is that in actual numbers?
It's a sample of, I think, off the top of my head, 300 primary schools. So we're probably talking about, at best, a few thousand children and their parents. It's not a giant sample. I mean, these are indicative figures. It doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2 or 3%. It's not 50%, right? It's not 20%.
Mm-hmm.
It's around 1%, unless you want to take issue with the picture as sketched here. I would say that from my experience, or what I read, what I've experienced myself, this seems just about true, accurate, the case, right? Functionally, the language has died. This is another one of my beefs, where people keep saying, "Oh, the language is going to die out. It's going to die out soon." No, it's not going to die out all that fast. Languages are resistant, and they, even if under strong pressure, they tend to hold out for longer than many people expect. Well, my observation is it has died out. For most people, it has died out. It has not died out for a small minority of people who are mostly elderly and who mostly live in the countryside and who still use it in informal spoken settings. But beyond that, for your average teenager who represents the future, right, it has died out. And it died out not a few years ago, it died out a couple of decades ago. Because we are in our 30s, 40, okay, I'm 40, I confess. We didn't grow up in this century, we grew up in the previous century. And we already grew up in a situation where the national language had, for us in our reality, almost completely replaced the, say, indigenous language of the region.
Mm-hmm.
I'm monopolizing the conversation again. So.
Yeah, you feel very strongly about this, don't you? I see what you're saying. And I said I was thinking about something else. I was thinking more in terms of, activist terms. That 1% still is worth fighting for, as long as the language is being used by no matter how small a percentage of the population. It's still there. It's still being used, and so it's still alive. It's either dead or alive.
Yes, obviously we agree about that. We agree that we should make an effort to, by this point, reintroduce it rather than keep it from disappearing, because for the younger generations it's already disappeared. We can want to reintroduce it, just like Cornish, which died out a little earlier still, like around 1800. And that's now been reintroduced in some nursery schools, possibly a few primary schools. I'm not quite sure. So there's now a very small batch of native speakers among young children, so this is a language that had completely died out, if relatively recently, and is now being revived. So yes, you can do the same for Saxon. It doesn't matter if it's still there or partially gone or mostly gone or entirely gone. You can still start introducing it in schools, start introducing organizing politically, which brings us neatly
to the next point,
to the next agenda item.
I want to add one thing, which is a nice imagery. In one other podcast I had with the founder of WikiTongues, which is a project for preserving minority languages worldwide, and which I'm trying to fit in our tight schedule of the Saxon series in between. The imagery popped up that a language is like a house. They get abandoned. In order to keep them livable, we need to keep working on the language, right? We need to keep redecorating every now and then. We need to give it a new paint, just your regular maintenance. And if you don't, it becomes unlivable and it just becomes a ruin. Ruins might be attractive to move back into and to start rebuilding it. Right? Yeah.
And ruins are romantic.
Yeah.
And they draw people's interest for that reason.
Exactly.
Which we've been talking about previously, right? This romantic trend that cropped up in the basically late 18th and 19th century. For Saxons, certainly much of the 20th century. This romantic view of Saxon as this ancient, mysterious, unchanging language of farmers with traditional knowledge and old rural ladies who know about witchcraft. Exaggerating a bit now, but this
black cats.
This trend to see the language as containing some kind of secret that is threatening to be lost in the great push for modernity, and therefore this renewed interest in studying non-standard and regional and minority languages.
Well, that is one of the arguments. Lots of language preservationists, if that's a word, do put forward. They say this and this language or so holds a very key element of knowledge about some certain plants and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think you can preserve these in any languages. But
yes, and also it's still to this day very frequently it's romantically said as an argument for the preservation and for cherishing Saxon, and no doubt other languages as well. Je kunt er zo mooi dingen in uitdrukken. Het voelt echter, het voelt dieper. Het komt er zo kort bij.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it comes so very close to you. You know, het griepen achter het vestje and all those things. Yeah, it really, tugs your heartstrings.
You can say things that you cannot express in the standard language, which, I mean, let's give people a break. For native speakers, this is true, and this is typically said by older native speakers who just know these expressions that are very meaningful to them, and that just it cannot really translate into the national language.
Mm-hmm.
Even if probably there are equivalent expressions, but it's not the ones that they are the most familiar with. Even I, as a non-native speaker, I vividly remember my grandmother saying certain things in certain situations over and over again that just capture the essence, the heart of the matter. And I want to say, and I blatantly say in Saxon, because that's just the only true way to that I'm familiar with, that I then have to mostly translate for my audience or help them understand what I'm talking about. But this is this is what I grew up hearing. This is how it's best expressed for me.
A friend of mine had a very nice expression today. They were having a barbecue last weekend. They were sitting, it was pissing rain, it was, they said, we're still going to sit outside because the temperature is nice. And they have this cover where they can sit under, right?
Yeah.
And he said, ik kijk zo koud naar buiten. Ik kijk er zo koud uit. You're looking outward so coldly. Like you can see that it's cold outside, and it does something to you. You can immediately sense that it won't be nice outside, which was a very nice expression. And I was thinking about it. He's much like me, in that he's learned Low Saxon at a later stage, but that is a very Low Saxon thing to say. Kijk er zo koud uit.
I can think of a very much less poetic example where my mother used to cut my brother's toenails that used to grow quite long, and my mother would say, "Sukke schoffels." And I don't know that there is a word in Dutch to say long toenail. And there are many such examples. It's telling situations where, to this day, between my mother and us, we throw in a lot of Saxon words into our Dutch because we just always have. And they present a nice picture, right? For some reason, Low Saxon expressions can help you describe a situation better, I believe. If you're Now I'm doing the exact same thing. Now you're being a true romantic. Okay. So shall we say a thing or two about politics?
Sure.
Because for the longest...
What do you want to know?
Well, for the longest time, you had the situation where Saxon was, shall we say, informally being maintained and spoken by the people, the ordinary common people. And I'll stop fiddling here. Fispeln, fiddling with things. Fispeln.
Fiddle.
Right. So that's a direct cognate of fiddling, right?
Skij zoete fiddle.
Yeah. In my family, we say fispeln. For the longest time, there was this informal maintenance of Saxon by the common people, but politically, zero recognition. This changed as early or as late, if you will, as the 90s. I don't know if you have the overview that I shared, and if you want to, because I don't want to talk and talk and talk.
Mm-hmm. They're going to leave the talking to me.
Well, I wouldn't mind talking and talking and talking, but if you want to talk, if you want to mention the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, and after that the Covenant.
Oh, sure. So for a long time, Low Saxon was, as we established in the previous episode, actively ignored by the people that run the country. But then Europe comes together in the EU. When people come together, they discuss things, and they discover that there are a load of minority languages that could do with a little extra help. So the EU draws up this charter, which is called the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages.
Actually, it was drawn up by the Council of Europe. I think that's technically not the European Union, but it's a Europe-wide initiative.
It's a Europe-wide initiative. I'm not too familiar with the organizational side of things. So that basically splits up languages into 3 categories. There's a chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. And chapter 3 is what I believe the strongest form possible that you can get for recognition for a language. 2 is somewhere in between, and 3 is I'm going the wrong way up. And chapter 1 is like those are the dialects of a certain language or a certain variety.
And depending on the level of recognition awarded to a given language, there are certain obligations that national governments under this charter commit themselves to in terms of offering it in schools, offering it in courts of law and other areas. Right.
Exactly.
And Saxon got partial recognition.
Yeah. There are certain rights and obligations attached to it.
And I think that the Netherlands maneuvered themselves into a position where the recognition boiled down mainly to being a kind of symbolic recognition without any obligations to do anything that really...
Well, it was sort of relayed. They relayed their responsibilities to provincial level. They said, well, if the provinces want this and they can find enough people to, back this and work on it, make things happen, then by all means do. But we're not gonna coordinate this nationwide. So Frisian was recognised under Chapter 3. Frisian currently is one of the state languages of the Netherlands in Frisia, which means that in court proceedings and all kinds of public offices, things should be done in both Dutch and Frisian, or at least they should have a translator present. I think in 2018, Low Saxon was promoted from Chapter 2 to Chapter 3, but only symbolically.
Yes.
Not entirely sure.
We should specify that the charter in question, this European-wide charter, under which different national governments decided which languages spoken within their borders merited some level of recognition and protection. It was introduced or adopted and ratified in the Netherlands in 1996, and then in Germany for the Low Saxon spoken in Germany in 1998.
Right.
And since you mentioned 2018, that's also when a new document was cropped up all of a sudden. That was cooked up between the provincial governments and the national government in the Netherlands, called the Covenant on the Dutch Recognition of the Regional Low Saxon Language, the wording having been very carefully chosen to keep all parties as happy as possible, or equally unhappy anyway.
Because it doesn't mean a thing.
Well, the regional Low Saxon language, what is important here is that, and this is actually, it's true enough that on a political level, Neder-Saxisch, Low Saxon, as it's called in official circles, is now routinely being called a language, not a dialect. And this is actually what distinguishes it from a Dutch dialect such as Zeeuws. Of course, this is as much a political discussion as it is a linguistic discussion. But going back to that first charter for a moment, when speakers of certain regional varieties of speech, shall we say, saw that recognition was being awarded to Limburgian and Low Saxon, they said, well, we'd like that too. And so Zeeuws, which is the regional speech of the province of Zeeland in the southwestern Netherlands, also applied for recognition under this charter, but was rejected, or was not awarded recognition because on the argument that Zeeuws is a dialect of Dutch, or in the sense that it has helped contribute to the formation of Standard Dutch. It's one of the ingredients that go into the making of the Standard Dutch language, whereas Low Saxon has a separate history and tradition and did not contribute nearly as much, although it certainly did contribute to the making of the national language of Dutch. But because it has a separate history and separate roots linguistically, it did merit recognition as a language. So long story short, at the very least, whether or not we have any speakers left, we now call it a language rather than a Dutch dialect. Well, maybe people on the ground don't always do. They happily go on calling it a dialect, but officially it's a language. Politically it's a language.
An unspecified dialect. That's right. Just last weekend, I spoke to some people who commented on my book, and they say they had these anecdotal stuff from their own life, in which they said, yeah, when he spoke Dutch and when he spoke dialect. So they don't specify what dialect, but obviously from the, from the people speaking, we all know they mean Low Saxon, but they'll never say Low Saxon or Twents or whatever. They just call it dialect.
Well, of course, but you and I live in this bubble of people who take a specific interest, and just like we are unfamiliar with certain sports jargons, they are going to be, completely unconnected and not in touch with these developments. Even though the developments percolate because you find them in the media. The newspapers now write about Neder-Saxisch, which is a word that we growing up never encountered at all. You could have slapped me in the face with it and I wouldn't have known what it was, right? And now I realize it happens to be that language that my family always spoke. It's been given a new name. political initiatives, it might be a nice opportunity for you to talk about your specific municipality of Riesenholden and what the municipality offers in terms of language services.
Yeah. So I live in the municipality of Riesenholden, and Riesenholden is the first bilingually Low Saxon Dutch, or Dutch Low Saxon, not in any particular order, but municipality in the Netherlands.
In the province of Overijssel.
In the province of Overijssel. And that basically entails that whenever you go to public affairs for, requesting a new passport, or if you go up to the counter of the Raadhuis, the
town hall. Yeah.
Town hall. We have so many churches, I can safely call Riesen a city. Yeah, if you go up to the town hall and you address the people there in Low Saxon, they're obliged to speak back in Low Saxon, or at least, invite a colleague to help you out if you don't.
Well, they're obliged sounds like they're put on a rack and made to speak it, but I think it's very generally being, they're happy to.
Right, yes, they're very happy to.
Many employees speak the language natively.
They imagine. Do.
Yeah.
Some do, some don't. This, of course, doesn't count if you phone into the town hall, which recently kicked up a row. Not by me, I must admit. It wasn't me. And
somebody phoned in and demanded services in Saxon that they were refused over the phone.
Someone phoned in and they were very, very forward with their request to do the entire thing in Low Saxon, and they were very vocal about not being answered in Low Saxon themselves. So that's another thing. But one of the other things is that you can have your marriage arranged in Low Saxon by certain speakers, public speakers.
And I imagine that your marriage opted into that. You got married in Riesen.
Yes, I did. Yeah. But the one who married us was so nervous because it was a friendly service.
Yeah.
He was so nervous he forgot the Low Saxon part.
It does happen that these social situations or meetings where it is agreed to use Saxon as the language of the function, that people unconsciously, even if they're native speakers, they slip into Dutch or probably happens in Germany, slip into German without being aware of it and just carry on, or start code switching a lot because they're just not used to either speaking the language at all, not even in their family situation, because often they're married to someone from the other side of the country. Their life is lived in the national language, let alone in official situations where it's normally speaking unheard of to use anything but the national language or English.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's understandable, right? That these things. I mean, it happens to just about everybody. So strong is the influence and constant presence of both the national languages and the English now. Yeah, but it's a thing that just has to be kept up and practiced. And
but once again, it's mostly a symbolic move to proclaim Riesenholden as a bilingual municipality, because the actual dealings are almost exclusively done in Dutch. So only the counter workers, the counter clerks.
Yeah,
those are the ones who speak Low Saxon. But you won't get documents in Low Saxon. Or?
No. I mean, we have to be clear about what we mean here. It's not as though the town hall meetings with the provincial politicians, when they get together, they will speak Saxon on a ceremonial day once a year. And this happens in many municipalities. But otherwise, they use the national language. What we're talking about here is if somebody steps up to the counter in the municipal building, they can speak to the receptionist and they can talk about, that extension they want to build to their home, or whatever issue they want to talk about, they can just speak the local language if they so want to. So it's a very informal, even sort of laid back situation.
It is. Yeah. Everyone is free to do as they want. Councilmen, they're not allowed to do it during meetings, during official meetings.
Yeah.
They're only allowed to do it once a year.
Yeah.
So it's very funny to see that there are many people from this town who were raised in Low Saxon, who speak Low Saxon on a daily basis, even up to the point where they enter the hall, enter the chamber, the discussion room. And once they sit down, they switch to Dutch.
Yeah.
Every one of them.
They've just become too important. It's one of those situations where if you're too important and too knowledgeable, you just forget your knowledge about your home language.
And it's still up for discussion whether or not the municipality will have bilingual signs when you enter this municipality. Do we have to say Rijsselholte and Riesenholten? Because we're bilingual, right? But what are the costs? What? It's so expensive, Chris, to have a few signs.
To touch on this briefly, the signage in roadsides that welcome you into the town and proclaim the town's name. It's quite amazing that even on a symbolic level as this, it is very generally considered unacceptable and completely unaffordable to acknowledge in writing the traditional name of the town, in our case in Saxon. So if you enter the town of Nieuw-Leusen, where I'm from, nowhere will you learn that it's locally called Neeluizen. You will only see the Dutch name Nieuw-Leusen. And then on these signs on the side of the road as you drive into the town, it will say hello and goodbye in a variety of languages, Italian and Finnish, and as crazy as you want it, but not in Saxon. Never say "Godgaan." Well,
I know of a few municipalities here that have a slogan like "Godgaan" or
sure,
"Welkom,"
and a couple of bilingual signage. And in Germany, I think it's a bit more widespread than in our case. But by and large, you don't see the bilingual signage. Possibly in the Stellingwarven provinces, municipalities in Friesland province, because they're part of Friesland, which already has a greater awareness of the bilingual situation.
They're familiar with that sort of thing already. Yeah. And I did notice in Drenthe, there are a few, I think Hesselen, like Oosterhesselen, which in Low Saxon is Hesselen. They've recently put up a bilingual sign and they were very proud and it made the news. And that was that. Well, I think it's about two or three municipalities in Drenthe and a few local villages in Twente.
Yes, about once a year you get a news item about another town that has got the official signage replaced with, it now being bilingual. But in Drenthe, there's this rogue action by some shady characters who for years now have occasionally gone out at night and pasted homemade signs over these official road signs with the Saxon name of the town that they have decided to modify on that given night. And that makes for a nice news item, and it's always been strenuously denied by the Drent Saxon organization Huis van de Tol they had anything to do with it or knowledge of who the perps were. But it always made for a bit grandiose.
I see a certain smirk there.
No. My name is Haas. I really don't know. But another way that you...
Ik kom uit luisteren en ik weet van niks.
Is that a song?
No, that's what the people from Losser always say.
Right.
Like they pretend to not know anything.
Another area in which Saxon has recently got more has long been used traditionally, but now has a kind of policy level recognition as well, is in old age care, old age homes, which is, of course, exactly a segment of the population that still very broadly speaks Saxon. And as they're getting older, they very much benefit from being offered the possibility of conversation in Saxon from caregivers.
And it's a very good way to reach out to the young people as well, because the carers, and the interns and young people who are supposed to be the new care workers, they're sort of, it would be very handy if they knew a few bits and bobs of the language to make themselves understood, especially in geriatric care. When there's, monolingual people who fall back on the language of their youth, which is Low Saxon. So if you don't speak Low Saxon, you'll never get through to them.
Yes, and carers, it's typically a job that for which people stay in their own region. But increasingly, you get people from other backgrounds or people from migrant backgrounds who do speak Dutch, but they don't speak Saxon. They don't speak the regional language. So even if you can statistically predict that for quite some time to come, there will be elderly people who, especially, of course, when they cope with dementia, or at least with memory loss, or that they will very much benefit from the ability to communicate in Saxon. It's going to be more and more difficult for young caregivers who work in these, who provide care, whether in old age homes or at home, to have the ability at all to accede to that that desired situation. So now you have in educational settings a learning module called Streektaal en de Zorg in the Netherlands, regional language use in care settings, where I don't know to what extent this program encompasses the actual teaching of Saxon phrases to people from a background who don't speak Saxon. I think it's more about raising awareness of the desirability of using it in the first place, if you're able, as a professional, to use it with people who need medical help or geriatric care.
Yeah, so the young people are often very much told that you should learn this language, but there are very few actual language courses.
Yes,
which is one of the things that most new Nether Saxons complain about.
Right.
Because, all the old people, they tell them, you should learn this language, and very well if you do. But we can't help you.
Yes. We're seeing some modest progress in this area with a book that, for instance, came out, was it last year? Twents for Dummies.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I don't know if it's as complete a language course as your typical Hugo method for learning German or French, but
it usually isn't. And there's questions about the efficiency of learning from a book rather than going out and just speak it and learn it by doing.
Well, but that's available. You can go out and find speakers, even if it's very hard for regional languages that are not spoken at all by many people. So you really have to make an effort to go out and find people who precisely are going to be the people you are less likely to meet, elderly people. But we're talking about the availability of materials, right? So we're specifically talking about books, internet courses. We're seeing things happening, even though we're not going to discuss the internet just yet.
So we're still stuck in the 20th century.
There are a few more things to be said about education and about other cultural expressions in Saxon before we get to the whole internet and 21st century. So do you want to try and squeeze it into this current episode?
Yeah, let's have a go. So we've just covered politics, as you said, education.
Well,
I'm scrolling through your document here.
Education, we haven't we haven't covered yet, really. But we can only touch on it very briefly, I think, because there's so much to be said on it. I mean, there's education in terms of studying regional languages academically at universities, all the way over to teaching it to some extent or other to children, which are completely different, pursuits, all of which fall under the heading of education. If we just look at universities for a start, there are a couple of universities that occupy themselves with the study of Low Saxon. This is not a new phenomenon, because you have the discipline of dialectology, at least it's traditionally been called that in the Netherlands, which has a long history and was actually a very popular discipline in the 20th century.
But it's very funny. It's often, Low Saxon is often covered in Dutch studies.
Covered in Dutch.
Whereas,
covered in the mud of Dutch.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yes, it becomes a subsection of a broader discipline.
Yeah, and it that too, and it's always looked at from the Dutch perspective.
Or the German perspective.
Or the German perspective in Germany.
Which we saw previously.
Part of Germanistik.
Exactly. And when we discussed the history of Saxon, we saw that the oldest period is called Old Saxon, and the modern period, at least in the Netherlands, is called Neder-Saxisch, Low Saxon, but in Germany it's called Niederdeutsch in High German, Plattdeutsch, and the middle period is called it's generally known as Middle Low German, and we established that this is because, or our going theory is that it's because this has been a German preoccupation, because most of the Middle Low German culture and economics happened in northern Germany in the context of the Hanseatic League and of 19th century big names in literature. So it was German scholars studying what they saw as a German thing. And to distinguish it from High German, they called it Niederdeutsch, Mittelniederdeutsch for the period from about 1200 to about 1600. So anyway, the university level study of regional languages is not a new thing. And it even used to be bigger than it is now, because as you say, it is often ranged under a broader discipline, as at the University of Groningen. You have a special chair in Low Saxon and Gronings language and culture. Actually, that is a chair dedicated to Low Saxon. But I think it falls under a cluster of Dutch and Low Saxon and Frisian. And this specific chair, so the study of Saxon at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, goes back to the 50s, when the first, at least in the Netherlands, the first professor of Low Saxon was appointed, I think in 53, Klaus Hansen Hieroma. And there was the founding of the Low Saxon Institute. And they looked at Low Saxon not just from a strictly academic perspective, not studying strictly the linguistic side of it, but under Hieroma and subsequent professors of Saxon, they were also very much engaged with the community of speakers, writers and others who wanted to emancipate the language and build it out and raise its profile and raise its status. So this was from the 50s going forward. But then that specific chair disappeared in 2010 with when Herman Niebaum retired, who was the last professor of Low Saxon. Before him it was Hendrik Entjes, and before him it was Klaus Hieroma. But currently there's this, as I said, special chair in Low Saxon and Gronings language and culture, Martijn Wieling. So there is a measure of continuation, but he's a part-time appointment for this studies. And then in Germany, you have a chair in Low German and Zeta Frisian at the Institute for German Studies at the Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg, Professor Doreen Brandt. and I don't know if there are any other professorates in Low Saxon, but there's a few things at the university level. I don't want to quite capitalize the conversation, so I'm looking intently at you to see if you want to jump in at any point with your helpful observations.
Observations, right. I must admit that I haven't really studied, where and where not Low Saxon is taught or not taught, and at what university. I can say from experience in dialectology studies at the University of Utrecht that whenever there was mention of particular dialects being spoken in the northeast of the Netherlands, they were always regarded as, or at least presented as, well, not exactly in those words, but I could sense that people were often considering them a nuisance because they tended to do things differently than what they would have expected, and it would mess up their hypothesis. It would mess up their hypothesis, and because this is a different language, and this is from the time when Low Saxon wasn't as recognized as it is now, and people weren't very aware of those things, and politics can dictate that it is recognized, but that has to be, the news has to be broken.
It has to start to trickle through.
Yeah, exactly. It has to, people need to become aware of it first.
But are you saying, am I understanding correctly that in academic circles you have this traditional understanding that Saxon and other regional languages spoken in the Netherlands and in Flanders perhaps were part of the Dutch language, were dialects of the Dutch language, and were studied as such and understood as such and classified as such, and then with the new reality where politically Low Saxon has got recognition as a separate language, that messed up their traditional classifications and understandings? Is that what you're saying?
I remember one instance where there was this lady who just, graduated or promoted on a certain topic. I can't remember exactly what it was, but she presented some, some ciphers. The word eludes me at the moment.
Some figures.
Some figures, right. She presented some figures in neatly arranged tables. And there was, this happened over there and this happened over there. And there was some dialects, but they were dialectal, and we couldn't trust the results very much. And I was like, hang on, this is my region, and you're just discarding it as, something that doesn't support your thesis, and that as it didn't suit them. So rather, I'd say, that's another clear indication that this is a separate language and should be treated as such, and shouldn't be taken into consideration if you do studies into Dutch proper, right?
And it also requires a level of specialization that most linguists, even if they focus on Dutch studies, do not have. And if you look at people with a true academic knowledge of Saxon, you can count them virtually on the fingers of one hand in the Netherlands. Right, we know all the names. And Bloemhof, Vader Scholtmeijer.
You've just mentioned them.
Philomene Bloemhof, Herman Niebaum, who's originally from Germany but taught at the University of Groningen, and other linguists who look at several. Dutch is a big subject of study, very big subject of study. Dutch literature, Dutch aspects of grammar, and what have you. Most of these linguists don't know the first thing about Saxon. If it bit them up the backside, they wouldn't know what bit them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and these, if I think of it, all of these people who do know the first thing about Saxon are from the Saxon-speaking areas and have a traditional affinity with it, and often, it's their mother tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from that, if you look at the whole subject of the academic study or the university study of Saxon and other regional languages, that has gone on for such a long time, and it's completely separated, you could say, from the question of whether a language has enough vitality to survive in the modern era. You can study a language, you can study how it changes, you can study how it starts to come under pressure from national languages, or in and of itself, it's not helpful in terms of language preservation, which is a subject that's close to our hearts. And one of my heroes, and I want to talk more about him at a later point if I can, Arnold Rakers, who was, well, as Dutch a German as you could find. He was from the Landkreis Graafschap Bentham, which borders on the Netherlands.
Which is basically Twente.
Yeah, I think historically the Niedergraafschaft and the lower northern part of it was called North Twente, actually. We should look into that too. Anyway, it borders on your specific region of Twente. Arnold Rakers, and yes, I mean, they speak Twents there. Well, they speak Graafschappenplat, which is basically the same as Twents. The most important difference is that Twents is under the roof language of Dutch, and Graafschappenplat is under the roof language of German. And in that sense, they're growing apart, but in every other sense, it's the same language.
It's exactly the same. I've had the pleasure of meeting some people from there.
Yeah.
And it's very much the same.
Yes. I mean, it's a language spoken in Germany that is really, you could range it under Dutch Low Saxon, which is to do with factors also of the Dutch political presence there that we can't go into now. But it is completely mutually unintelligible with German. But sadly, like Saxon in general, it's no longer spoken by young people. It's disappearing. But also, happily, there are initiatives being taken. Anyway, Arnold Rakers, who was a German linguist, right, from the Graafschap. He was from Noordhoorn, the city of Noordhoorn. He lived from about 1900 to 1960 something. And he was a linguist with a background in the study of Saxon, but he was also mystically inclined, and he developed very original views on what he ended up calling the Modersprache, the mother tongue. He didn't much care for other names by which our language is known. And he believed that this top-down academic study of regional languages or dialects is a cold thing. It's like dissecting a dead animal. It's done by people who don't really care have no affinity, don't really care about the living, beating heart of the community of speakers. And he said that's what we must focus on if we want there to be any future for the Modersprache, for our mother tongue. And he was one of these people that moved about in the 50s in a cultural phenomenon, mostly retroactively called the Neder-Saxische Beweging, which we'll talk about some other time. But that's what he had to say about the academic top-down study of Saxon. And then perhaps lastly, we can talk about a very different aspect of education, which is not the study of the language by linguists, but its actual introduction as a subject for pupils to learn. What can you tell me about that? We didn't learn it.
Can I tell you about... We didn't learn it.
No.
And you're asking me what I think about Arnold Rakers. Obviously, he was a very clever fella. And he was quite right. Because I do get the sense that some people you mentioned are looking at it top down to this date. And say, oh yeah, it's very funny, it's very nice, this dialect. Yeah, oh yeah, very funny. But they have no real feeling with it. And it's just... as academics were taught to, shut down our feelings and look at it, neutrally. And of course, I can advocate that. But at the same time, I'm not just an academic. I'm also a person who actively lives this language, right? Who actively speaks it and who actively wants to keep it alive. So, yeah, there's always a bit of a, playing field tension between, should I just regard it as, if it disappears, it disappears and there's nothing I can do. But at the same time, I have the ability to do my part.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was what Rakas was getting at.
Yes, we really should get back, not just to him, but to the specific cultural phenomenon and actually international collaboration that was going on in the 50s between Saxon speakers in the border areas of the Netherlands and Germany, mostly.
So that's what you were getting at.
Well, I wanted to ease into this other aspect of Saxon and education, namely it being taught to pupils and students. And is it being done? To what extent is it being done?
I think in the 50s, not so much. At least not to young people, as we've established earlier. But you get all these, dialect groups springing up, and they all start developing materials in the language. And whether they are aimed at a young audience, that's up for discussion. But they are presented as, if you want to learn the language, this is what you can do. Here's a lovely story about a farmer going to work. So there are continuously materials being developed. Despite its low status, people are still writing in this language. They're still creating poems. They're still creating songs, and that has never stopped.
Sure, but you're enumerating loose cultural initiatives that are being taken, sometimes in organizations, sometimes by inspired individuals. But specifically talking about the realm of education, I found a rather extensive article on Wikipedia that goes into the teaching of Saxon in schools. I think specifically talking about secondary schools, because it said that Saxon was quite recently made an elective school subject. Now, if you talk about electives, these are it's a menu of subjects that students can choose. Okay, I want to study this language, not that one, etc., and they compose their subjects.
But this is the 21st century, right?
Oh, I see what you mean. You didn't quite want to go there because it's too recent. You're right. No, we are talking about the 20th century. So we can generally observe that in the 20th century, far from Saxon being taught at all, it was actively being discouraged. It was being doodgezwegen. It was not talked about, as though it didn't. Like your and my experience in school was that it was not even its existence was acknowledged, much less were you handed. Well, in your case, a little bit was said about grammatical cases.
If you spoke it in class, you run the risk of being dubbed a dumbass and being sat in front of the class, and because you can't speak properly. That happened up to the 70s, I believe.
Yes, the situation of the Welsh not as English speakers from Britain will be familiar with that term. That was just before our time. And then in our time, that was not needed anymore because children didn't much speak Saxon anymore anyhow. So it had been, they had been educated out of it. But yes, I was getting ahead of myself and talking about school initiatives in the 21st century. But that's a subject for a subsequent episode, and we're now at 1 hour and a half. Maybe a good time.
We can't help ourselves, Chris. We can't help ourselves.
No, we can just about keep this a coherent episode if we agree that we've now covered the 20th century, and at a subsequent time we can move into the 21st.
Exactly, and it's a lovely cliffhanger as well, because not all is lost.
Oh no, not all is lost. No, by no means.
A lot is, but a lot isn't. And that concludes our 4th episode. If you like what you hear or have certain comments or questions, do drop us a line in the comment section. See you in the next episode when we finally reach our current day and age as the internet takes over. Slán leat an Ródchán.